Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here with a brief primer, I suppose is the best way of putting it, on the economies of the Iron Kingdoms and those other nations of Immoren who have what may pass for an economy. Like the piece on newspapers or broadsheets, what's definitively known about the economics of the setting is relatively little, but interesting where the lore exists. Naturally, given the world state as the background of both an RPG and a wargame, realism is not to be found here. But there are nonetheless a fair few details which may be considered fascinating, or rather neat little touches which provide a little something to those who wish to play into this angle for their narratives. As to be expected, it is an exclusively RPG-related topic, with only handwave or incidental effect on the wargame. Not that it matters to the narrator at all. Perhaps the most stable thing about the Iron Kingdoms throughout the last few decades, though one may argue for one exception, has been their economies. A better way of putting it may be that the least unstable thing about the Iron Kingdoms has been their economies, which may be a touch more accurate. Each nation has their own currency, internal trading standards, production standards, and trading policies, which mean they are all prone to some measure of isolationism, which in the modern era has ranged from the moderate, as in the case of Signar, to extreme, such as Ios, with most nations falling somewhere in between. Cultural differences, enforced diplomatic rifts, and the ever-looming threats of wars and invasions have promoted such isolationism. And despite long-standing friendships among a small group of nations, even they are not immune to this desire for self-interest. However, perhaps the biggest factor which drives the civilized powers, let us say, towards preserving their financial resources in favour of any alliance's assets is the uncivilized powers of Immoren. Those cultures or grand strategic goals have no need for such complications, and do not care for their vagaries. Consideration of technology and its integration with the arcane is the best indicator for the complexity of a country's economy. Consequently, there are the advanced, the archaic, and the aberrations. The first two should be relatively self-explanatory, while the third exists because an economy is predicated on the cyclic and altogether predictable requirements of the living. At least, what living populations require are conceptually predictable. On the other hand, the undead and the quirks of those who raise the undead make matters pertaining to the economic awkward to properly assess. Specifics for each will follow shortly. On the whole, those countries which do trade with each other are generally quite superficial in their undertakings, exchanging only simple things such as produce, goods and knowledge. The sums which are transferred between treasuries are generally not that high compared to what a nation can truly flex in terms of financial influence. Instead, each government, and to a similar extent the nobles who are nominally answerable to said government, hoards its riches in the event of an emergency or crisis which necessitates substantial outlay to pay for military production, related contractors, and mercenaries to stave off whatever existential threat presents itself. And when the danger is past, what remains goes to rebuilding and investment for the future recovery of monetary reserves. This cycle, if perhaps with a few more steps to it, continues, among the Iron Kingdoms in particular. Others, such as the Rulic Dwarves and the Scorn Empire, are driven more by an internal dynamic thanks to regular conflicts from within their own polities, which occur and are resolved independently of any external influence. The economy of Ios, however, is unique for being self-contained, yet simplified by an enforced lack of influence, both internationally and upon itself due to the very limited circulation of its coinage. Lastly, Crix is the alluded-to major aberration, since while the flow of monetary resources around that realm may charitably be referred to as an economy, it is not as the civilized of Immoren would consider it. As one may gather, the undead and the necromancers who raise them place a much different value on money and other forms of legal tender than a merchant of the Macarian League might. As concerns the specifics of nations in the modern era, the advanced economies would be those of Cador, Signar, Ord, Lael and Rule, though Ord toes a line with being an aberration. They can be characterized as such thanks to having some measure or other of international trade, which means a cross-border agreement concerning the value of each other's currencies have a not insignificant effect on the buyer's or seller's regional financial fluidity. But the conflicts which occur among these nations and the prevalent culture of mercenary activity means the wise are careful to limit just how much of their domestic currency's value departs from the customs jurisdiction. Quite how hawkish they are varies from nation to nation. For example, as the last to do away with the parochial practice of serfdom and the most notable instigator of conflict among the Iron Kingdoms during the eponymous and modern eras, Cador has perhaps the most isolated economy from among the aforementioned countries, and they can afford to maintain their position by virtue of an immobile population. There is very little by way of migration from the Cadoran Volotskia to the other countries and vice versa, and indeed there is little migration among the Volotskia themselves. This placed the centralised government which the throne controls nominally on a near absolute basis. On the more open side, Signar trades regularly with her neighbours, both privately and as a state, though amongst these amicable trade partners the possibility of such a thing as a nation in debt is horrifying, for one need only look at Lael's recent history. Relevant to individual traders, thanks to a multitude of perils which merchant convoys face, both on land and at sea, security, transport and insurance, whether of the cargo, the transportation or liability in the eventuality of loss or damage, can together run up costs which, depending on the trade route, be guaranteed to outweigh the value of the goods themselves. This results in domestic trade doing a great deal more to circulate produce and currency than international trade. Even away from their civilized enemies, should they come to be at war, such perils are imposed from several corners, including, but not limited to, the vassals of the Circle Orboros, whether they act on orders or otherwise, Crixian raiders, some of whom venture far further inland from their shoreline hunting grounds than many would prefer, as well as their predictable maritime ventures. Occasional Grimkin incursions, which are as inexplicable as the Grimkin's own motivations themselves at times, Trollkin highwaymen, for not all Trollkin creoles are amenable to cooperation with the humans of the Iron Kingdoms, and the unpredictable actions of other peoples of the wilds, such as the Gatormen and Pharaoh of their respective realms. And each threat comes with its own cost upon buyers and sellers of goods, whether it is theft, destruction, incapacitation or death of transportation contractors, and so on and so forth. And as incidents increase and decrease in frequency, providers of logistical services will inevitably change their prices accordingly to either discourage use of particular trade routes or have the income to mitigate any potential loss which may be incurred by said trade routes' use. This volatility, as we may consider it, is a large contributory factor for why states and their governing bodies are reluctant to allow trade to become a substantial part of their economies. Today's trading partner may well be tomorrow's enemy across a battlefield. Consequently, for the goal of stability, trade is much more common within the length and breadth of a country itself. Thanks to the internal dynamic among a nation's regions, whether it is the duchies of Signar, the Volotska of Kedor, the counties of Rule, and so on and so forth, there is often no love lost among the nobles whose domains share borders, and it is to the benefit of the central government that they spar in whatever manner they may, without matters descending into open violence. Only Rule has the codified system which permits clan feuds to escalate to a form of regulated warfare, possible only because the word of the tribunes and the moot of the 100 houses is beyond reproach, and it is a foolish clan lord who disobeys it. As a result, rival nobles can jeopardize each other's treasuries by one means of economic one-upmanship or other, but no matter the result, customs, tariffs and taxation mean a monarch's treasury maintains its health. They need not interfere except if one side nears bankruptcy, whereupon simple executive regulation can restore what passes for balance. Best of all, such interactions among regional powers has little effect on the greatest imposition of cost, the logistics provider, who has much less to worry about when hauling goods domestically, and much less distance to worry about it for. Concerning the Archaic economies, such would be those of the Protectorate of Menoth, the Scorn Empire, and Ios, and in all three instances this applies to how they were during the modern era and how they are now. The economy of the Protectorate of Menoth was always restrained by its theocratic government. Upholding the tenets of the true law meant the Synod had a continuously difficult public relationship with the concept of money, even more so with that of money lending, and by association the practice of banking. So much so that extensive ownership of the precious metals, which typically formed the balance of minted coinage, was and remains frowned upon. The solution was legal tender, which both was and is, literally, of no value in any other country, made worse by the lack of any means to exchange it. At least among Signar, Ord and Lael, if to varying degrees, counting houses or regional branches of a bank can be found in the major cities close to their respective borders, where traders can exchange the coins of one nation for those of another, for a small fee, of course. In general, organised trade of a scale which would be normal further west simply never happened in the Protectorate, to the best of my knowledge, only the sort which might be found in town markets and shuffled among local villages. Meanwhile, control of the nation's natural resources was quickly assumed and delegated by the Synod itself, with no potential for private business and entrepreneurship to make anything of it. As for the Scorn, while their culture has evolved over the millennia, some aspects have not, including a feudal system long abandoned in the West. This, in turn, affects how wealth is handled, both in terms of distribution and maintenance. The Hoxoon disdains the concept of managing money, for no other reason than the codified Hoxoon does not mention it at all, thanks to the Warriors' Code predating legal tender in Scorn society by some centuries or more. Thus, loans are conducted privately, among the independently wealthy, and contracts are signed at the lender's peril, instead of overseen by regulations which govern a bank's dealings. And by the same note, trade deals are handled directly by those parties who own and wish to purchase goods, with no oversight involved. With an economy which is largely sustained by the output of slave labour and social mobility being extremely limited, money in scorn culture has somewhat limited use, meaning its circulation is as simple as it can feasibly be, exchanged for goods, services, or a freeman's labour and little more. And Ios once traded freely with those nations which bordered the Mistbow, and the realm of elves had the sophistication and complexity of an advanced economy. But isolationism in the decades since the outbreak of the War of the Great Houses saw it recede upon itself. Even when trade did occur, the incompatibility of Iosan currency with trade partners made things awkward at best, something caused by the coins being crafted from glass and crystal, and not minted using metal, which made its value more impractical than was worth it to determine by non-elven financiers. This meant opportunities were limited, as buyers and sellers had to independently negotiate prices after a period of learning each other's domestic trends and the respective buying power of their legal tender. After Ios closed its borders to any and all, Iosan coins became a luxury collector's item abroad, while the country itself reverted to a much simpler economy with limited internal trade and far less investment and money lending, exacerbated by a naturally small and steadily stagnating population. Lastly are the aberrations. Ord has some measure of this, since piracy comprises a large part of the state's income, thanks to the influence held by the High Captains of Five Fingers. That Baird Cathor II is nicknamed the Bandit King adds a certain legitimacy to the activities of the Ordic privateers, who are only a few letters in name away from being pirates, since most are given semi-officious paperwork permitting them to engage in merchant raiding, even if said paperwork isn't accepted by any other state organisation in Immoren. Ord isn't a naturally resource-rich country, and plunder brings some relief to a people who often struggle to eke a living from a land which lacks the fertility and harvest found elsewhere. Such is this prevalence of seafaring raiding, the degree to which it has been integrated into Ordic society, and the eventual movement and fate of their ill-gotten gains. Privateers and traders can very easily be confused with each other, to the extent that among Mokarian League officials there is much as synonymous. The more distinct aberration is Crix. In an even more undeveloped, even primitive manner of doing business than any other nation, banks and the very idea of banks plainly do not exist within the Crixian archipelago, despite what the term the treasury of Skell might suggest. This is both because of and as a result of a lack of any consideration given to the concepts of investment and money lending in any formalised way, a feature only coincidentally shared with the Scorn Empire. And far more so than Ord, Crix's resources are, in large part, supplied by maritime raiding conducted by the Sedictus and detachments from the Slaughter Fleet. The blight which spreads throughout the archipelago, thanks to Toric's presence, along with the naturally aggressive approach to life and diplomacy of the native peoples, makes the concept of economy an altogether irrelevant one. At a more basic level, even were we to ignore the undead part of the populace, international trade, and even domestic to a large extent, is of little use to Crix, whether its government or its people. This is caused by said lack of resources, which leads to an absence of exportable produce and a cultural outlook which disdains the idea of equivalent and voluntary exchanges. What little which can be obtained from the lands and surrounding seas is acquired, and whatever else is necessary is taken from, to take a typical Crixian's perspective, the weaker peoples of the world, by foul means or fouler.